what is going you all hear that? And what's going on in Israel, what's going on in the media, how do we understand it, how do we talk to other people about it, how do we understand it ourselves and just be able to relate to Israel in that kind of a way. So we're really honored to have Daniel speaking to us. He is actually in Israel right now. He's up at a very crazy hour to be able to talk to us at a normal hour for us. And I'll just read a little bit of his bio so you guys get a sense of who he is. I know a lot of you know him either from Southern NCSY or from other NCSY activities. So Daniel Geller has been involved in the pro-Israel political movement for over 10 years. He currently serves as the director of the Nitzavim Fellowship, a program designed to empower and train gap year students to become leaders in our community. Before making Aliyah to Israel, Daniel worked with NCSY and JSU to bring Israel advocacy education to thousands of high school and college students around the country. He currently resides in Baca, Jerusalem, and works to strengthen the Jewish and pro-Israel American community. So we're really excited to have Daniel here. This program is brought to you by the NCSY as a whole, NCSY alumni, and especially our Judah Fellows. Our Judah Fellows are leaders on college campuses across the country. If you want to learn more about that, you could go to ncsy.org/Judah. But for now, we will turn it over to Daniel Geller.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's really great to be here with all of you, even at this hour, or especially at this hour. There's nothing I'd rather be doing at 4 a.m. So thank you all for joining. I am just going to ask if everyone can turn on their cameras. I understand if you can't, but I will never know if my jokes land if I can't see your faces. So this is really one of the more important things to me. And the other way of how I work, aside from seeing your face, which is definitely a highlight for me, but if you ask questions, this will be a far more enjoyable experience for everyone, as opposed to me talking for an hour straight. So if you have any questions, you can type in the chat box, and we will absolutely make that a priority, because as much as I love hearing the sound of my own voice, actually educating and you learning something is actually the priority here. So please do not hesitate to answer questions. We'll start with social media, and then we'll get into whatever you guys like. But if I were to ask, and if you're not going to turn your camera on, just type in the chat box along with us, so we know that you're here, and answer and ask questions as you see fit. But if I were to ask you on a basic level throughout the year, not without a focus of what just happened in Israel, right? What is the general sentiment towards Israel on social media and the media overall? You can go from mainstream media like the BBC, CNN, Fox News, to social media outlets, AJ Plus, if not Now This, whatever it may be. What is the general sentiment towards Israel? This is going to be an interactive thing, guys. I'm just letting you know now. Noah.
Okay, so I'm very new to being a part of the news and social media, just because I'm coming into all that. But my main social media outlet is Instagram. And ultimately, I haven't been seeing anything about Israel. I've seen nothing about Israel up until recently.
Good or bad?
Yeah, I've you'll get that occasional America gives all their money to Israel, or sometimes you'll see oh, this anti-Semitic thing happened in Germany. You'll see some pop-ups, but I don't hear very much from that platform, which I use.
Okay, great. That's a good start. I rarely get that, so that's refreshing to hear for me. I'll tell you guys where I come from. Generally, if you were to pay attention to the amount of pro-Israel news versus the amount of anti-Israel news, it skews heavily anti-Israel. As Ashley put in the chat, and it's so good to Ashley and I go way back. Rebecca DeSico and I go way back. We spent a summer on TJJ together, so it's so great to have you guys here. But typically, the news is not in favor of Israel, and very simply, the news. What is the role of the news? What is the job of the news? And it's not to give over the news. I know that's going to sound counterintuitive, but what is the overall job of news outlets? Parker, want to give it a shot?
I was going to say inform people, but I guess I guess it kind of depends on if it's like a private station, I guess, or platform versus a public thing, maybe. Like
Okay.
maybe some would have more bias over others.
Yeah, we're gonna take like local news out of this, whose job is actually just to report the news. And it's incredibly wholesome of you to think that that's like, oh, give over the news. That makes so much sense. The goal of the news, if you look at CNN, BBC, Fox, whoever it is, their job is to get you to continue watching the news, to get more people to watch the news. Why? Because they sell ad space in between their segments. So the more people watching, the more they can charge for their ads, which is why they document how many people are watching and which age group they're in. Why, if your job is really just to give over the news, why would you care which age group you're giving it in? Because anyone in the age range of 25 to 45 is more likely to buy products than anyone in an older age group. Okay, so their job is to make money. Wow, crazy concept in America. Okay, so it's not to give you the most unbiased perspective. They actually skew their news reports to be able to appeal to the crowd that they cater to. Okay, hence why MSNBC will lean left wing and Fox News will lean right wing because they are appealing to two different crowds. If their job was just to give over the news, then it isn't to, then they wouldn't be changed. It would be a very unbiased approach. So that's typically how major news outlets work. And then social media is the worst version of this because there's no expertise in social media. I know that's crazy. That everyone here has a social media account. I'm gonna make that assumption one way or the other. Okay. So did anyone ask you questions before signing up for your social media account aside from your age? Name, email, age, right? That's typically what, like they didn't ask for your PhD, they didn't ask for your master's degree, your bachelor's even, nothing. Crazy. But you can be a completely unqualified person in life to comment on anything in social media. No expertise required. And Israel, which is amongst, or the Middle East in general, which is amongst one of the most complex issues in the world, gets all these tweets, Instagram posts from people who have never even been here. They have no expertise, and then they're going to tell you, "Oh, Israel is in violation of war crimes." What war crimes? Here's a general rule in life: if someone ever accuses you of something, you have to have proof as to that accusation. That's how life works. So people, I'm aside from like, we'll put aside all the death threats. If someone were to message you like, "Oh," in a very trying to understand way, hey, can you explain this to me type of question. And they said, hey, Israel is in violation of genocide or ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people. Hey, has anyone heard that before? Ethnic cleansing Palestinian people, right? It's like a big talking point right now. Okay. You need to prove Joey every day. Wow. Joey, where do you type in the chat where you go to college? So you need to be able to determine why they're in violation of next year. Okay, fine. Tell me where. Why they're in violation of war crimes. What ethnic cleansing? If you're committing a genocide against someone, there's never been a genocide in the world that the world did not know about, right? Like creating up mass extermination camps, for example. But in conversations about Israel, it's always our job to prove a negative, which is impossible. You don't prove negatives, you only prove positives. So you can't prove why somebody doesn't do something, you have to prove why somebody does something. So I say, show me the case where Israel is in violation of war crimes. You need to be able to point to that. That's how accusations work. That is how the world works. So most of these people don't know anything beyond talking points. Just out of curiosity, a show of hands, a raise of digital hands, has anyone gotten negative messages over social media? Yeah, Noah. No, that's because you're from California. Everything's negative out there. Okay, Parker, and we're gonna assume other people. Jesse. Okay. So out of curiosity, do you guys engage with these people who are posting negative things, Insta stories? Okay. Do you have like conversations with these people? Half and half.
Uh, Sometimes eventually I come to the point where I realize like with some people I can hold a conversation. With some people it's like pointless because it's just kind of like a yelling match. It seems something.
Right, that's crazy. In America, people don't want to have a conversation. What? Okay, so overall, that is part of a culture that's been building in America for actually a couple decades. This isn't a new phenomenon. But overall, and whoever wrote um, Jesse, I appreciate Jesse's nuance here because there isn't an obvious yes and obvious no. Jesse, tell us in the chat where you go to school and let me know a little bit about who I'm talking about in theory. So if you were to really pay attention to how people come at the conversation, it'll determine exactly how you should be engaging with them. If someone's issuing a death threat against you, then yeah, you probably shouldn't talk to somebody who wants you dead. That's a great rule to follow in everything in life. But if someone comes from a genuine curiosity and say, hey, I heard X about Israel, can you explain this to me? Or I know you're pro-Israel affiliated with NCSY and engaged in the Jewish community. Why is this something you're prepared to have a conversation? And it's okay if you're not an expert, but be able to say, hey, I'm interested in directing you to resources that might be able to help is a completely appropriate conversation to have. It's okay if you're not an expert on Israel, and we need to even more so be appreciative of people who recognize they're not an expert on Israel. They didn't make up their mind based off of an Instagram post they saw from an unverified source. Like even someone, it was unbelievable. Someone once messaged me on Instagram and they said, they forwarded me an Al Jazeera story saying like, oh, Israel's like killing civilians in Gaza, right? And what's the problem with Al Jazeera? Let's see how many people are following like world economics or anything. Wow, Joey, amazing. Al Jazeera is Qatari state-funded media. Now, there's a lot of problems with state-funded media, but if you're Qatari state-funded media, what does Qatar fund outside of Al Jazeera? Hamas. So Qatar sends hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas, and they also fund their own newspaper. So when they mix, they're probably not the most unbiased news source. We can probably go off of that theory. So if you're only reading Al Jazeera, then yeah, your perspective of Israel is going to be very skewed. If you guys ever hear Bella Hadid, she's like this supermodel, I think, or I don't know why we call them supermodels, maybe just model, like a model who's Palestinian, and she has 42 million followers on Instagram. So she posts significantly about the oppression against Palestinians. She posts all these rallies she goes to. So 42 million followers on Instagram is 3 times as many Jews as there are in the world. So even if every Jew were to be posting positively about Israel and really getting involved in this issue and engaging with people, it's still a third of the amount of people that this one person reaches in one Instagram post. That is the challenge we're talking about here. So when we talk about this idea of like losing the war in social media, then yeah, it's hello, Matt. That is the idea that we're facing, or the challenge that we're facing, because those who are opponents of what we believe in, of what we're trying to accomplish here, typically are so much louder than the pro-Israel voice. And then if you want to go a level deeper, what do people in general, let's like anyone a psychology major out of curiosity, or taking psychology classes? Wow, okay. Crazy, a group of Jews, no psychology majors. Okay, so from a psychological level, what is a more tantalizing headline? That Israel is targeting Palestinian children in the occupied territories, or that Israel is not in violation of war crimes? Which one draws your eye a little bit more?
Obviously, everybody wants to hear. Everybody wants to hear that, like, the children, the innocents, not like right to defend.
Right. Even right to defend. Like this is my like one of the most hated lines I have in everything about Israel. Like Israel has a right to defend itself. Hey, who are you to determine who has no one in the world has any right to determine who has a right and who doesn't have a right to defend themselves. It's like, it's a false premise. Like, all these politicians come at it from a good place. And it's, you guys are familiar with this concept of signaling. Yeah, does that ring a bell? Maybe not. Okay, so we'll just do a crash course. Signaling is cultural terminology or phraseology that identifies to a particular community, that you stand with them. So politicians will utilize this to get votes, right? So the most prime time example, if anyone's paying attention to like what's going on in the political realm, and we're not going to get into American politics here because that evidently is a taboo subject. But when President Biden was making his cabinet secretary picks, he selected Pete Buttigieg to be his Secretary of Transportation, who has a pretty limited experience in the field. So when he took on his when he accepted the position, his speech was categorized as being just full of signaling towards the left wing of American policy, to be able to show that although he's relatively inexperienced for the post, that he cares about the issues they care about. So he utilized terms like a free and equal economy, right? So that has nothing to do with transportation, but overall it has everything to do with causes that we care about. So it's the same as saying, you know, identifying with any groups, like saying Black Lives Matter. For the Jewish community, it's Israel oriented, or to be able to determine that Israel has a right to defend itself doesn't actually mean anything practically, because of course Israel is going to defend itself. Israel is a sovereign nation. Every sovereign nation has the ability and even the obligation to defend itself. But to show the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community that we stand with you, we're gonna reaffirm your right to defend yourself. Okay, so it's like one of those things. Like, it's almost appalling to think that anybody thinks that we don't have the ability to defend ourselves, right? So that's really what we're talking about. Also, just in general, for all the people who just joined, I've been speaking way too long already. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to throw it in the chat box. If you want to even use your voice, that'll be a novel idea as well. So feel free to jump in at any point.
I have a question.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, you've been on Zoom calls with me. You know how I operate. Yeah. Go.
So you've been talking about Israel's right to defend itself, and like using the recent case as an example, like the Hamas fired first, and therefore, like, we understand Israel has a right to defend itself, but everybody I've spoken to is like, well, this happened first, and this happened first, and this happened first, and this happened first, which is all true. Like, so much happened leading up to the rocket firing, but nobody wants to admit that Israel like was right in one thing, and in the right to defend itself. Like, how do you get around people who just all they want to do is prove you wrong, make you feel wrong?
Yeah, God forbid Israel should ever be right. So I'll tell you guys the approach I take, and I take this approach on social media only with people because social media are basically random people. Like, you have no idea who you're talking to. And like, if it's your friends, then you should have a real conversation. But if it's just some random person messaging you from Idaho, like, what's the value? Like, the amount of time you can spend speaking to strangers. This is like the big problem with Clubhouse. Now Clubhouse is like a major platform for anti-Semitism. It's almost as if like all anti-Semites got together and said, hey, we're going to create a lot of like speaking rooms about how much we hate Jews. So like, that's a big problem in Clubhouse, and they definitely need to do work on it. But like, you could run a Clubhouse room for 10 hours straight if you wanted to, and people will be engaged and ask questions, but you have no idea who you're talking to. You know, so being mindful of how much time you're spending with like random strangers is definitely something to take into consideration. But the way I start these conversations with, number one, is to determine if they're genuinely interested in learning, is always going to be step number one. And then once you've established that, you need to establish a few basic truths. So like, we don't need to get into complexities. Complexities allow people this idea that they can kind of waver and say, like, people like seeing only when it fits their narrative, but in general, people like seeing like the both sides perspective. Like, we shouldn't only be supportive of Israel because there's a whole nother side here. Like, there's no good and evil in the world anymore. They're just sides. Like, while we come from democratic values, we believe there is an absolute good and an absolute evil. Like, but there are people in like communists believe that America is an evil entity, right? It's not a notion of like who's good and who's bad. It's like what side you're identifying with. So if you wanted to be a nuanced person, so to speak, although nuance is all but dead in American discourse, you would say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, but they don't have the right to kill Palestinians because that's unfair. Because Israel has this like one of the best armies in the world with some of the most sophisticated technologies and military technologies, and the Gazans don't have really any military. It's just this this Hamas, terrorist group. So here's how I synthesize the conversation. First is gonna be to determine. Welcome, Neely. First is going to be to determine, A, is this someone who actually wants to have a conversation? That's going to be one. If the answer is yes, okay, move forward. Second is going to be, the methodology I take on is that I want to ensure the person I'm speaking to does not promote or support terror in any way. Okay, so my next question is to be able to say, before we move forward, can we all agree that Hamas is a terrorist organization and is indiscriminately firing missiles and rockets into Israeli populations, which is in violation of a war crime? Okay, like let's start off on the same page. We always need to, whenever you're engaging in this conversation, you need to define terms. You need to be able to say, all right, we're not saying Palestinians, we're saying Hamas, because Israel is not targeting Palestinians, they're targeting terrorists. Okay, that's important for us to understand. And I need to know that you don't support in any way a terrorist organization firing against my people, firing against my nation state. Like they're not firing rockets so it like hits the barren wasteland of the Negev. They're firing into civilian populations. Okay, that is a terrorist organization. So that once we agree to that, okay, then we can start talking about this and understand we might not agree on everything, and that's okay. But to be able to understand basic truths is a tremendous feat. So what are the basic truths we should start outlining? Number one, Israel did not fire the first shot in this particular round of violence. Israel rarely fires the first shot. In 1967, that was, for all intents and purposes, a defensive war, even though we fired the first shot because our intelligence said that we were about to have this massive war. So we took out the Egyptian Air Force before they could start their round of destroying our people. Okay, so this was entirely a defensive war, but people are going to say, how does this conversation go? If anyone's following along, that, oh, Israel is disproportionately responding, as if there's like a measure of how this goes. Israel, they fire 4,000 rockets, so Israel can only commit X amount of airstrikes. That's not how the world works. Once you are a sovereign nation under attack, you have to, in theory, destroy the entity that is firing against your population, right? Your job is to protect your citizens. That is the job of a sovereign nation, okay? And it's crazy because people think that applies except to Israel. Israel is always held to a higher standard or a different standard, which is just not at all how the world works. And we talk about, I'm gonna go on so many tangents right now, so somebody should just like pull me back in 2 minutes. But like we talk about all these things in Israel. Like Israel's in violation of war crimes. Israel is occupying Palestinian land. Israel is oppressing Palestinians. Israel is ethnically cleansing Palestinians. Israel, all these things, right? X, Y, and Z, things that are fun buzzwords on social media or in public discourse. But what do they mean? They don't mean anything because they're not backed by fact, but they're exciting narratives. So what does social media and regular media latch onto? That Israel is launching all these airstrikes. I did not hear over the course of mainstream media over the last operation that over 400 rockets that Hamas fired from Gaza actually landed in Gaza and killed some of their own people. Like I didn't see that covered in any major news source. Why is that? That's not honest reporting. So you're going to say Israel's entirely to blame for all the deaths in Gaza? It's definitely not true. And number two, if we really want to take a nuanced approach here, who runs the Gaza Health Ministry that reports on all the deaths happening in Israel? One group, 5 letters. Starts with an H. Hamas, okay? Hamas controls the group that is reporting the amount of deaths happening in Gaza. So because they're the catalyst of all this and a known terror organization, it's probably a likely scenario that the reporting is not so true. Probably. Not to say people aren't dying in Gaza. Of course, people are dying in Gaza, but Israel's precision, and they released the video of there's some amazing like videos now because we live in the 21st century. And it's also why this is so on social media and regular media, why it's such a compelling story, because you can get footage from as if you're standing within Gaza. Because Israel takes every step to, like, this is also one of those things I bring up in conversation. Israel takes every potential step, even alerting our enemies to let them know that we're coming for them, to prevent civilian casualties. This is like an unheard of concept. No one in the world calls their enemy and tells them, we're actually going to bomb your location, so we're going to give you enough time to get out. Like, no one in the world does that. And there are videos, like the Palestinians film it, that they film the landlord and people. We have geographic technology that can let us call every cell phone in a given area that we're about to bomb. And first we drop, it's like they're referred to as knockers, or they're duds. They're like bombs that aren't real bombs. They drop it off on the roof of the building to let it, and it just makes a very loud noise to let people know that this is going to be a targeted building. Then they drop leaflets in Arabic that say, we are about to bomb this building. Please leave and bring everybody out with you. And then we call everyone in the area saying, trust us when we tell you we are about to bomb this area, you should leave. 3 different ways in which we are alerting our enemy that we are coming to try and kill them, in essence. Like, civilians aren't the only ones who get this message. Hamas terrorists also get this message, okay? So Israel goes through every step possible to prevent civilian casualties. And then when they actually target the building, either they'll level the building because they're incapable, it's like significant infrastructure. Where does Hamas keep their terrorist infrastructure? Okay, we'll do a 1 or 2 fingers thing. 1 finger if it's in military bases off to the side, or 2 fingers if it's in apartment buildings, hospitals, and kindergartens. Wow, Matt held 4 fingers, which wasn't an option, but I so appreciate the effort. Right, 2, right? They are firing from civilian population, which is a war crime to begin with. It's a war crime to fire on a civilian population, and then it's a war crime to fire from a civilian population, because you know that Israel is not going to not respond. So you're forcing them to respond and put civilians at risk, which is exactly what Hamas cares for. And we're gonna pull everyone's disillusions away from them and say that Hamas does not care about their own people. Okay, this is a theory, but one that has pretty good evidence to show that Hamas does not care about their own people. Yeah, Parker.
Sorry, it's about something you said before.
Yep.
I was like reading, like some people were saying on Instagram that Israel, I think it was like at the end of this whole, like, the air raids, before the ceasefire, is it true that they stopped the alerting people before bombing buildings, or that was just always?
No, it's Israel policy. It's like, I mean, there's a theory. I've never seen it practiced, but there's a theory at one point Israel will stop alerting, and they're just going to say, like, screw it, in essence. But I've never seen that come into practice. And in the end of the day, going back to our war with Lebanon, there was, unfortunately, Israel accidentally blew up a school, which had a lot of casualties. So at that point, the international community applied so much pressure that Israel had to stop its campaign to kind of destroy Hezbollah and terrorist infrastructure in the north. So Israel is very cognizant that whenever they launch an operation, all eyes will be on them, and they work tirelessly to really ensure. There's an amazing. I'm really happy to send it to you. There's a recording now there, because we live in the 21st century. I'll just post it in the chat for you guys that you can look at it later. But there's a recording of this account, by the way, is like really amazing to understand what's happening in Gaza and what's happening with Israel in general. But it's a recording of an Israeli intelligence officer calling a farmer on the border of Gaza and Israel, and discussing, like, and speaking in very, very plain, language, not in any nuanced way, but saying, you should really get off of your farm right now. It could be dangerous for what's about to happen. And he says, like, do you mind? Like, I just wanted to turn my water off, like, whatever. I highly advise, if you have a minute and a half, to go listen to understand the lengths that Israel's prepared to go to protect not even our own citizens. Like, these aren't our own people. We don't get taxes from them. They're simply civilians. Israel is you ever hear Israel's a beacon of light unto the world? This is what we're talking about. Like, we actually care about life, not just Jewish life. We care about life. So that's a big part of this conversation that people tend to miss, because they're going to say, well, Israel has launched hundreds and hundreds of airstrikes against an indefensible population that even if you want to say Hamas is a terrorist group, they're not capable of defending themselves. against Israel. And Israel's response is so simple. If they stopped firing rockets, we would stop launching airstrikes. Like Iron Dome has a 90% success rate. If they stop firing rockets, that would be a 100% success rate. Wow, this is so easy. And yet, where the world prefers to make this a story, it's so much more appealing. We get so many more viewers and more likes on my Instagram post if I accuse Israel of war crimes. Okay, so that's the conversation. Any other question at this point? I saw Rebecca posted. There are a ton of websites and accounts on social media that you guys can follow. And everyone's biased. There's no longer any unbiased media. That's not how the world works. The one thing I will recommend, if you really want to understand in Israel, because what do we say? We say, who's putting out the news in Gaza? Hamas. Hamas is putting out the news in Gaza. Qatari state-funded media is putting out the news in Gaza. So that is unreliable media. But then if you're arguing against me, what's your response? Guys, independent thinking.
Media is biased too towards.
Wow, Matt, amazing. They teach you that at Arizona State? Wow, go figure. So right, Israel media is also biased towards Israel. So how can you say that's trustworthy? So I tell people to do the following thing, and even for you guys to understand how things work here, we have a free press in Israel. You can file stories that are unflattering to Israel. That's okay. So if you really wanted to understand it, you can read 3 different perspectives, all coming from Israel. And there are plenty of news stories that come out of Israel that do not shine a bright light onto Israel. You can read Jerusalem Post for a more right-wing perspective. You can read Times of Israel for a more center-left perspective, and you can read Haaretz for a more left-wing perspective. And Haaretz has time and again criticized Israel for their settlement expansion, for certain techniques they take on oppressing Palestinians, so to speak. There are these opportunities for you guys to learn in an unbiased or a biased way, but understanding where the bias comes from. And then you can say, look at this filing from an Israeli news source that is not flattering of Israel. Okay, Israel does not control the news. So you can really understand all these different perspectives. And then there are activists on the ground, and they might not be the most intelligent people, or they might not be the most well-informed, but you can understand sentiment. So while Israel, we'll take a prime example. Like, anyone heard of this group called Palestinians? Okay, that's great. It's a good start. Okay, so the theory around Palestinians, or the story that surrounds Palestinians, is that they are an oppressed people. So what will you see on social media? You'll see that like Israeli military doing raids in Palestinian villages. Okay, so they'll say, look, this is Palestinians constantly being oppressed by an occupational regime, right? This is like very classic language. There's nothing worse in the world than being, according to Western culture, than being a colonialist, right? There's like nothing worse you can call any like governing power than being colonialist, going in and taking over land that's not yours, even though it is something America does all over the world. But people don't care about that. Only when it's Israel. Okay, so yes, that video of Israeli soldiers barging into a home and doing a raid in a Palestinian village is very disconcerting. What they're leaving out is why Israeli soldiers are doing a raid in the middle of the night in a Palestinian village. Probably not because it's fun, because our army is comprised of 18 and 19-year-olds. This isn't like something that it's like these 40-year-olds had nothing to do. It's because there is a terrorist threat that has been identified in your village. That is the only reason we're there. We're there to make an arrest. That's it. We're not there to make your life miserable. Okay, but they're going to say, look how terrible Palestinian life is. Look at the houses we live in, even though they're multi-million-dollar mansions in Palestinian villages, because their government is incredibly corrupt. They're going to say, like, wow, we can't vote in elections. That's not our fault. We offered them to be citizens. They wanted their own state. So we signed the Oslo Accords in the 90s, which created Area A cities, right? Which is like, if you guys Nablus, Shechem, Damascus, Jericho, Ramallah, these are all Area A cities. These are all areas that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And who's not allowing them to have elections? It's not the Israelis. Mahmoud Abbas is in his 16th year of his first 4-year term. So to give you an idea how much he's embraced democracy, okay? Not to mention Mahmoud Abbas is he has his PhD. This is one of my favorite games. I think Noah and Eliana know this very well at this point because I mentioned it on every Zoom call I'm on. Mahmoud Abbas has his PhD. You can refer to him as Dr. Mahmoud Abbas, and he is the president of the Palestinian Authority. What if you were going to be the president of the Palestinian Authority? What would you get your PhD in?
Political science.
Wow, Dahlia, right out of the park, political science. So no, that's not what he got it in.
I know it's something super anti-Semitic, like something about like oppressing Jews or something.
Wow, Matt's been on this call before. Mahmoud Abbas has his PhD in Holocaust denial. He wrote his thesis. He wrote his dissertation on how the Holocaust was overly exaggerated, and the Jews, the Zionists, used it as a platform to be able to gain sympathy from the international community.
Why did you just use air quotes?
What? Because Zionist is code word for Jews.
Okay.
Right. Why is it that shuls, like Jewish houses of worship, are vandalized with Free Palestine? What does Jews living in Far Rockaway or California davening have anything to do with a conflict going on in the Middle East?
Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Wow, this just in. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So Mahmoud Abbas argues that the Jews utilized this fake notion of the Holocaust to leverage the international community to stealing a state from the Palestinians. And while it sounds ridiculous now, the very notion of how the Palestinian people and the Arab world operate is that they're incredibly patient. They're not like Americans. Americans are all about instant gratification, right? Like, just give it to us now. Even if it's not perfect, we'd rather an imperfect deal now than a perfect deal down the line. Palestinians will go on record saying, even if our great-grandchildren need to live in the same tent I'm living in now as a refugee, we will wait for what's rightfully ours. So what they think is rightfully ours, who can finish this line? From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free.
Palestine will be free. So they're not saying from the river to the edge of the West Bank. They're saying from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, all of Palestine will be free. They don't believe in a Jewish state. They don't believe in our right to exist. In 1967, okay, let's do a brief history here. In 1967, right, this is the defensive war that we fired the first shot in. We quadrupled, in 6 days, we quadrupled the land mass of Israel. We took over the Gaza Strip. We took over the Sinai Peninsula. We took over the West Bank, the Judea and Samaria. We took over Jerusalem, or the part of, remember, before 1967, Jews were not able to go onto the Temple Mount. Jews were not able to go to the Kotel, right? It was under Jordanian occupationalist control, actual occupational control, and we took over the Golan Heights. So we quadrupled the landmass of Israel. But after a war, if you win any land in the war, what do you have to do with it? Give it back. I see Eliana mouthing. She's not going to turn her mute off, but she had the right answer. Okay, that you have to give it back. So Israel said, okay, this isn't ideal, but we're going to be in accordance with international law and give all this land back to the Arabs. And it is contingent, however, on one thing. What's it contingent on? It's one word, also 5 letters.
Peace.
Peace. We will give you back all this land as long as we have peace. And then the Arabs came back to us with 3 no's. In history, it's known as the 3 no's of Khartoum. Khartoum is a city in Sudan, which is where this conference took place. So the 3 no's of Khartoum, which said no to peace, no to negotiation, we're not even going to sit and talk to you about it, and no to recognition, we're not even going to recognize your right to exist. So these are the people we're dealing with. They still hold these factors. We believe Omar Barghouti, who's the co-founder of the BDS movement. Any of you guys have BDS on your campuses or campuses that you're going to? Yeah, okay. So as a primer, and we're going on tangent number 47 at this point, but as a primer, BDS is amongst the most ineffective organizations in the world. They have not accomplished anything for the Palestinian people. And the co-founder of BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, Omar Barghouti, has gone on record saying, unequivocally, we oppose any Jewish state in the borders of Palestine. And if you believe that Palestine is from the river to the sea, that means there's no Jewish state. What do they think? They think our Jewish state should be in Uganda. Like there's no notion to suggest that the Palestinian people actually want, or the Palestinian leadership, I should say, actually want any Israel ever existing. Which is why their entire negotiating model has been, let's go to the table, we're going to talk and force Israel to make concessions, and then we're going to leave the negotiating table for a number of years, and then go back to the negotiating table and start exactly where we left off in an effort to make Israel give up more. Okay, so BDS, and Matt makes a great point here in the chat, that they actually hurt Palestinians. A prime example, if you ever want to say why BDS is terrible for Palestinians, in a couple of years ago, everyone's familiar with the company SodaStream, okay, Matt. So SodaStream, is run by two ideologues. They're two brothers. They entirely believe in this notion that how are we going to accomplish peace by Israelis and Palestinians working together, building soda streams together. Okay, and they employed about 400 Palestinian employees. Amazing. They had a factory not too far from where I live. It's about 30 minutes away in Mishor Adumim, which is it's a place, it's an industrial area. So Israelis and Palestinians go there for work. Just a fun fact, Palestinians will always make more money working for Israeli companies than they will make for Palestinian companies. And because Mishor Adumim is in the occupied territories, which of course is Israel persecuting and oppressing Palestinians, which I put that in air quotes because it's absolutely not true. But overall, because it's in what the world defines as Israeli occupied territories, there was a lot of international pressure on SodaStream to close down their factory in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, what we call Judea and Samaria, because it was supporting this Israeli occupation. It was supporting Israeli oppression. So based off of all this international pressure, spearheaded by the BDS movement, they had to close their factory and relocate. By having to close their factory, 400 Palestinian workers lost their job. And then even more so, if we want to take this a step further, SodaStream was bought out by Pepsi. So PepsiCo now owns SodaStream, and they had to, and because the heads of the company are huge ideologues, mind you, they bought it out to the tune of a couple $2 billion, they gave every one of their employees a couple $1,000s in raises. Now, mind you, the average Israeli makes about $30,000 a year. So if you get a bonus of a couple $1,000s, that is 10% of what you usually bring home in a year. That is a lot of money for anyone living in this region. Certainly Palestinians who don't make any money. But because they were forced to fire 400 Palestinian employees, they didn't get any bonus. So you, as the BDS movement, as a bastion for Palestinian rights, is solely responsible for 400 Palestinians losing their job and missing an opportunity to make significant money and significant economic advancement for themselves. Okay, that is not helping the Palestinian people, that is actually hurting them. Crazy concept. Yeah, Eliana, you have a question?
So I agree with everything you said, but I'll be devil's advocate for a second. Sorry,
my favorite. Go for it.
I'll talk louder. I agree with everything you said, but I'll be devil's advocate for a second. People would say, okay, Palestinians are working under Israelis and they make more money working under Israelis, but why are they so poor to begin with? And then they'd attribute that to the occupation.
Okay, I can play that game also.
Yeah.
So you know what we really attribute it to? Their leadership spends more money paying terrorists to kill Jews than they pay for anything else in Palestinian controlled areas. So the Palestinian Authority, remember, Hamas is officially a political group, but they are also a terrorist organization. So they're very honest that our one goal is to kill all the Jews, to take back Israel so it can be Palestine again. They're very honest about that. The Palestinian Authority, the Fatah party, which is Mahmoud Abbas, this guy we were talking about before, believes that he's not against negotiating with Israel. You know, he doesn't believe in Israel, but he's not against negotiating with Israel to be able to accomplish something for the Palestinian people. So how this manifests is that he will actively pay terrorists to kill Jews. And while the Palestinian people who are pro-Palestine over being pro-Israel or anti-Israel, as we should really be calling them, they'll say this is welfare. It's not welfare if you measure the amount of money they get on a sliding scale. So the more Jews you kill, the more money you make. That is an actual policy that exists in the Palestinian Authority. So when you pay a terrorist 6 to 10 times that of what you're paying a teacher, then I can entirely blame you for the situation that is going on in Israel. And Israel is, again, a sovereign nation that has to defend itself. So if you are paying terrorists to kill Jews, then we cannot provide unvetted access into our country. So people like talking about checkpoints, right? Like, oh, Israel puts up all these checkpoints where they oppress Palestinians. Has anyone ever gotten on a plane without going through TSA? Have you ever crossed any border, Canada, Mexico, gone into the EU without going through security? Right? So why should Israel be held to a different standard? That's ridiculous. You are crossing a border into mainland Israel. We're going to put up a checkpoint. And yeah, we're going to check the people who are not citizens, because that's how a normal country operates. And even more so, people love using this one example. Israel stops ambulances on the way to hospitals at checkpoints. Wow, what a warmongering country. That's terrible. Someone needs medical attention and you're going to search the ambulance before allowing them to go to the hospital. That's terrible. How is it you're a country that claims to care about life? How is it that you can stop ambulances? What's the response?
I think I've heard there was somebody that was I don't know the full story, but I think somebody was using an ambulance to I think they brought in a bomb or something in the ambulance and they let it through, so it
Yeah,
they had to check them all.
Parker's got it. Because I'm overly sarcastic and incredibly passive aggressive, I frame it like this. Maybe if the Palestinian Authority or terrorists didn't send bombs and ambulances, we wouldn't have to check them. Very simple. Our job is to defend our people, to protect and preserve life for our citizens. The Palestinian terrorists, it didn't necessarily come from the Palestinian Authority. Yasser Arafat, who used to be the head of the Palestinian Authority, he's an Egyptian who started this whole movement of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1964, before there was anything to liberate Palestinians from. But anyways, another side point, but Yasser Arafat was literally a terrorist. He used to plan terrorist attacks. We don't think Mahmoud Abbas is planning terrorist attacks. He just incentivizes terror. So he pays for terrorists. So they used to find 8-month pregnant women, like women who are pregnant into their 8th month, and used to give them bombs to attach themselves, thinking that the Israeli police and soldiers would never check a pregnant woman. We did, and we found bombs under stretchers. We found bombs with women, and it's an entirely abuse of your own people. When we're talking about Israel being responsible for human rights abuses, which is also not true, but you also need to look at the other thing happening. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are creating an environment that is dangerous to their own people. So that's a part of this conversation that people don't like to have. So when we talk about what you hear on social media, you can't only look at one side. You can't only look, oh, how can we criticize Israel? That's a dishonest approach. You need to look, how have we gotten here? In 2005, we unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. We used to have this idea of settlements of occupation that existed in Gaza. We had about 11,000, 13,000 people living in the Gaza Strip, and we needed thousands of soldiers to protect them, because it wasn't, as you can imagine, Gaza wasn't the safest neighborhood. So then in 2005, we pulled everyone out. We did exactly what the world wanted us to do. We unilaterally withdrew all of our people. We exhumed the bodies of loved ones. There were cemeteries in Gaza, Jewish cemeteries. So we reburied those people, those loved ones in mainland Israel, right? We pulled everybody out. And then we gave it to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was unable to maintain control, and Hamas killed all of the Palestinian Authority members in one night. And by kill, let's not pretend what we're talking, let's not disillusion ourselves. They pushed all the Palestinian Authority members off of roofs. And Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. Okay, so here we did everything the world expected of us. We ended our occupation, and they destroyed everything good about Gaza. Gaza used to have the best beaches in Israel. Gaza used to have these amazing greenhouses where it was a major exporter of flowers and fruits, and they just destroyed it. They didn't even use it for themselves. Like, they are against any notion of Jews thriving in this land, or just having a notion of thriving in this land. We'd rather spend our money for terror than making a great life for our people. That is the general story. I don't know how we got started on all these tangents. I mean, I think it all ties in at some point, but if anyone wants to bring me back, or if anyone has any question, how would you respond to Israel helped create Hamas? Okay, Israel helped create Hamas. Like, it's, how so? Like, what's that mean? Like, if you're gonna say just the very notion of Israel existing helped create Hamas, then yeah, because Israel created Hamas to fight against PA. No. We did not, like, the actual, like, creating or having our hands in the founding of a terrorist organization is not at all true. People will say, like, oh, if Israel weren't committing these war crimes, then Hamas wouldn't exist. Because what is the justification for terror is that the Palestinians lead such a terrible life and are so oppressed that they have no other option but to carry out violent acts against Israel. They've tried everything else. They've tried peace, even though they haven't tried peace. They've said no to every peace proposal. But they have no other option than violence. So that's the way people say, like, oh, because if Israel doesn't act the way they acted, then Hamas wouldn't exist, which there's no evidence to suggest that's the case. Did that answer the question? I don't know, Joey asked it. Joey, did that answer the question? Okay, great. Any other questions?
Do you see my question in the chat?
I'll go look at it now, Ashley. Whoa, this thing's like a paragraph.
Well,
okay.
I raised my hand before, you didn't see it.
Oh my gosh, this is why the mute button exists, to unmute yourself and then talk.
Yeah, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, I could talk for 3 hours. I could talk way longer, but, like, yeah, you should interrupt me. Okay, what's your advice on what to do about Jews on social media going against Israel in comments and posts and shares using information that is false and are therefore perpetuating the anti-Semitism, specifically speaking about on campus and not complete strangers? Okay, so important to note that people are typically ignorant in this area. They are not knowledgeable. They are going off of a false report or a very skewed and biased report. So let's acknowledge that Israel is launching airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. That is a fact. Like, I find starting with basic truths always helps us, like, kind of ease into the conversation. But Israel is targeting terrorist infrastructure. It is unfortunate that terrorist infrastructure is in civilian areas, is based out of kindergartens, is based out of hospitals, is based out of apartment buildings. That is unfortunate. But are you really going to tell a sovereign nation that they can't respond to terrorists trying to kill their people? Are you really going to say that 4,000 rockets is an acceptable measure of defending oneself against, and even in the occupational power, which we can talk, the occupation is a completely different thing. This didn't happen from one thing. There are a lot of there's a confluence of factors that led into this conflict, right? So you definitely can't say Israel's to blame solely. I don't even think Israel's really to blame at all, because we've offered every step of the way. There was a time when we offered, there are currently 400, I'm gonna get back to your question, but to give you guys an idea, there are 450,000 Jews who live in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. There was a time when we offered multiple times to give the entirety of the West Bank, this occupied territory or this disputed territory, back to the Palestinians, and they said no. Like, what more do you want? We are offering you, like, in theory, everything you want. You say this is disputed land, it's occupied territory, it's Palestinian territory, which is definitely not true. Remember, Jews are indigenous to this land. We are the descendants of the original inhabitants of this land, right? That means something in the way the international world works. But even so, even if you want to say this is disputed territory because of the 1967 war, like, you're not acknowledging that we've offered peace, that we've tried these things. So we need to establish basic truths that Israel wants peace. Israel's always working towards peace. We have offered so much. That's why Gaza is the way it is. You know, if we held on to Gaza and didn't withdraw in 2005, we wouldn't have had 15,000 rockets fired at our people. We wouldn't have had terror tunnels fired at our people. Like, you need to also be honest and just, it's a challenge saying like, you also need to be honest about the facts on the ground. Like if you're just perpetuating this anti-Semitism, like that's not making this campus a safe place for me. So I'd say if you're on campus, go set up a meeting with your deans, with the presidents of your school, even if you want to take it to the board of directors, and say, I'm a Jewish student who doesn't feel safe on your campus because you're not doing anything to stop the perpetuation of lies that allow the targeting of my community. So like either you do this or we're no longer feeling comfortable here. And I will tell all my Jewish friends that they should not come here. Like that's a very real reality. And people say, oh, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm only anti-Israel. I'm only anti a Bibi Netanyahu government. You can be critical of a Bibi Netanyahu government. We're all critical of a Bibi Netanyahu government. That's okay. But in the end of the day, if you're allowing a culture that supports the targeting of the Jewish community, remember, they don't differentiate between the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community. To them, it's one and the same. That's anti-Semitism. You are doing nothing to support Palestinian rights by vandalizing a shul or spray painting swastikas on the Hillel or Chabad. That doesn't do anything for your community, and it's only targeting my community. By the way, there are Jews who are not pro-Israel. That's crazy, but they probably pray at a synagogue. So this isn't about Palestinian solidarity. This isn't about calling Israel out. And I love this line: Israel doesn't do everything perfect either. Tell me what Israel isn't doing right. You need to show me how Israel is out of line. We're launching precise airstrikes where we are putting our own people in jeopardy. Like we don't send in ground troops because we value life. We value life so much that we value the life of our soldiers. So like we need to be honest about what's happening here, that Israel values life more than anyone else. We're launching precise airstrikes targeting terrorist infrastructure. We've offered peace time and again. We've withdrawn from, like, let's pay attention to history, right? History is one of those things people tend to disregard. It's actually pretty important. We withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. Now the Sinai Peninsula is one of the largest hotbeds for terrorism in the world. The Egyptian army has tried time and again to gain control of the Sinai Peninsula to no avail. They have been entirely unsuccessful. We withdrew from southern Lebanon. And now Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, is in control of Lebanon and has over 150,000 rockets pointed at our northern communities. Right? We withdrew from Gaza in 2005. We've received over 15,000 rockets and terror tunnels trying to kill our people in southern communities. These are not ideal by any means. Israel has tried time and again for the sake of peace, to try and move peace forward, to coexist. And it appears every time we try, it only hurts us more. Okay, some questions in the chat. Wouldn't it be a better idea to spend more on Iron Domes rather than 100,000 per bomb? If Israel knows Hamas is doing this, why still put their civilians at risk to damage military infrastructure? So Joey, I'm not fully comprehending the question. This people will say, like, if anyone heard this over the course of the last couple of weeks, Israel there are 12 people who were killed in Israel, and there are over 200 people who were killed in Gaza. So how can you tell me that Israel's really the victim here? That you have Iron Dome, so what 4,000 rockets isn't anything for you. Millions of people living in bomb shelters is not a status quo we want to live with. It also, even bomb shelters, right? Matt makes an amazing point. 90% success rate means that 1 out of every 10 rockets gets through. So, and even if you're in a bomb shelter, like it could be that the damage is extensive enough. Like you need to be mindful about the reality here. It's a dangerous precedent to be able to say, oh, because you're really good at defending yourself, you should allow somebody to attack you. Like that doesn't make sense. Like we can't ever set that precedent for ourselves and allow others to say, like, oh, because you invest billions of dollars in protecting yourself and you have this Iron Dome is just defensive. It doesn't take care of the problem. Like Hamas is not going to stop firing rockets or stop trying to kill us because we're really good at defending ourselves. Like all evidence to the contrary. Okay. Okay. So Jesse says, I'm on the Hill Executive Board at Queens, and we have been struggling with this a lot. The issue with getting in contact with staff and board members is that they get so many more people emailing them about not supporting Palestine than Jews, so they feel more compelling to release statements supporting them rather than being neutral and or supporting Israel. Okay, yeah, so this is definitely a challenge. If there's also a notion that money controls decisions. So like the board of trustees at your college, maybe it's worth emailing all them and setting up meetings, and really describing, like, regardless of what's happening in the Middle East, like if they're not a pro-Israel body, you should try making them a pro-Israel body and lay out these basic facts that we've been speaking about all night. Israel's under attack from a terrorist organization. Israel wants peace. Israel's millions of Israelis are spending the night in bomb shelters. Like, these are all basic truths that everybody can get on board with. Like, a 5-year-old should not have to run in 15 seconds to a bomb shelter. If Hamas were to stop firing rockets right now, this would end. Okay, that we are entirely defensive. So to share basic truths and like ask, can we all agree that Hamas firing thousands of rockets would allow a country to respond? Like, can we agree that that's something that logically makes sense, that that's how the world works? Okay, so with your Hillel, to be able to approach your deans and say, you can do it as a group and say, we'd like to invite dean whoever to the Hillel to have an open conversation and be able to, don't invite like Palestinian people who hate you. That's a bad idea. But overall, to be able to say, like, so you understand where we're coming from, because you're not putting out a statement and allowing this to fester. You're allowing hatred to continue on campus, and we get targeted as a result of it. So you need to stand up, forgetting Israel, you need to stand up for the Jewish community. Even more so, you should stand up for Israel, because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel provides so much humanitarian aid to Palestinians. We, every week, you guys can look up, I'll put it in the chat, Kojat. It is now it's escaping me, it'll come to me in a second. But they actively send humanitarian aid supplies into Gaza, right? It's the coordinator of government activities in the territories. So Kojat will release every week the amount of humanitarian aid supplies, medical supplies that they're sending to Gaza, right? Because we don't like people dying. We actually want people to live. It's a crazy concept in Gaza. So these are simple truths you really just need to put out there. And yeah, the opposition is always going to be louder. This is how we started the conversation. That, you look at someone like Bella Hadid, who has 42 million followers. Like, yeah, thank you, Parker. So you look at these people; they're always louder than us. Hamas is so loud as to saying death to Jews, right? So you would almost think that death to Jews is a normal thing to be saying by the amount of times it's being said, even in the streets of New York City. But realistically, this, under no circumstances, anything happening in the Middle East, justification for targeting the Jewish community in America. And that's something that the governing power of your university should understand. That, like, these are educational institutions. In theory, they're people who are educated, right? So put on your critical thinking hat and say, like, hey, yeah, that makes sense. The Jewish community should not be targeted for things happening in the Middle East, and that's anti-Semitism. You're not being like pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, as we call it, because you're targeting the Jewish community. Targeting the Jewish community is never going to free Palestine, whatever that means. Okay, Matt writes, one of the things I've struggled the most at responding to the past few weeks is that Israel terrorized the Dome of the Rock during Ramadan services. What would your response be to this? It's hard to find the line between agreeing that shouldn't happen while explaining why that is happening. Okay, so one of the contributing factors as to why this all started is that police stormed. Like, there's an account I follow on Twitter that's like very anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. So anytime there are Jews on the Temple Mount, they'll say radical right-wing settlers or occupiers stormed the Temple Mount this morning. So, hey, how do you know, like, they're settlers? Like, if you live in Tel Aviv and you go onto the Temple Mount, no one thinks like Tel Aviv is the occupied territories, unless you're one of these people who really believes that Jews don't belong in Israel at all. But they're gonna say, and it's just this group walking on the Temple Mount with an armed police escort. They're there because the Temple Mount, or where Al-Aqsa stands, where the Dome of the Rock stands, was also where the Beit HaMikdash, where our holy temple stood. Right? It is also a holy site for Jews. So Jews will go onto the Temple Mount to visit, to pray, to see what is also a holy site for them. But like for anti-Israel people or pro-Palestinian people, they say, no, this is only a Muslim site. It's not a Jewish holy site. that Jews should have no right to the Temple Mount. Okay, but that's not how it works, because it's also our holy site, and it's technically in Israeli sovereign territory. So Jews should be allowed to go there. So the Palestinians will say, oh, the Jews are always coming on and oppressing us, whatever, and just showing like they walk onto the Temple Mount with all their guns and with all their police and their occupationalist army, and this is just another way that Israel is oppressing Palestinians. They're coming onto a holy Muslim site and showing that they can come on anytime with their guns because they are the occupying power, right? This is the general narrative. So mind you, when groups go up, it's like it's not a lot of them, maybe 30 of them, and they need police because they get attacked otherwise, right? This isn't because we're showing our strength. I'll tell you guys just a quick anecdotal story, Matt. Then I'll try and answer your question. I was once visiting East Jerusalem, so a Palestinian area, Silwan. So very few Jews live there, but there are certain Jews who live there to show that this is also Jewish territory. Like this entire area used to be Jewish. Even the Palestinians who live there will say that Jews used to own their homes. So I asked the guy giving us the tour. He's the spokesperson for this particular area, and I asked him, like, isn't it indicative that the Jews who live there have very significant security for obvious reasons? Okay, there are very few Jews living in an area that's overwhelmingly Palestinian. So I asked him, like, isn't it indicative of the challenges the Jews face and how far we are from peace that the Jews need all this security, that they need, like, a woman, like this mother and her son were walking with 2 armed guards to get from their house to the supermarket. Like that's the type of area we're talking about. And it's like, no, they're not at all in danger. It's Zionist propaganda, and really they're just doing it to scare us. Like, what do you mean to scare you? There are like 50 of them and there are thousands of you. Why is that? Like, how is that a genuine thing? Like, and Jews don't need a lot to destroy us. Like, that was his response to me. Being able to say, like, you just need a few of you to give cause. So if you look at Hebron, right? Hebron is like one of the most contentious cities in the world. There are 400 to 500 Jews who live in Hebron, and there are 200,000 Palestinians. It takes 3 army bases to protect all the 400 Jews of Hebron, and it's also a holy site for us. It's the patriarchs and matriarchs. So, and it's like bewildering to me, like from a logical perspective, that you can say, you know who the problem in Hebron is? The 400 Jews. They're the reason we don't have peace. 200,000 Palestinians, they're doing fine, because throwing rocks is completely acceptable. But that's the world we're living in. When you talk about media, like, just take the logical approach. Does it really make sense that, like, let's take the last operation. Over 200 Palestinians in Gaza killed, 12 Israelis. Okay, so if you were just to put that out in front of me, like, yeah, of course Israel is the oppressing power. Like, they have this unbelievable military, and they're just firing off these rockets. But you also need to take into account Israel spends billions of dollars and invests so significantly in protecting its citizens. Every Iron Dome interceptor costs $40,000. Now imagine, like, Hamas realized, okay, if we overwhelm Iron Dome, we're not just going to fire like 20 rockets, we're going to fire 200 rockets at a time. And that way, Iron Dome is going to get so overwhelmed, it won't be able to intercept all of them. And in the process of trying to defend ourselves against 4,000 rockets, think about the hundreds of millions of dollars you're spending to do so. These rockets cost a couple $100. They're not incredibly sophisticated, right? So we're playing this game. So yeah, if you just say 200 Palestinians versus 12 Israelis, that sounds terrible. But if you look a little bit deeper and say, wow, Israel is so prepared to defend its citizens, that changes the narrative entirely. Okay, Matt, getting back to your question. So how do we talk about Al-Aqsa? How do we talk about the Temple Mount? So it is both a Jewish holy site and a Muslim holy site. Jews should also have the right to go there. So too, we share, like, Muslims are our biblical cousins. Okay, so dating back to Ishmael. So in Hebron, when you go to the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, those are also Muslim patriarchs and matriarchs, and they're also welcome to pray at these areas. We actually have like a swap thing where they have like a certain area that's theirs, we have a certain area that's ours, and we swap at certain points throughout the year so everybody can pray throughout the year. Okay, fine. But if you're throwing rocks, and when we talk about rocks, we're not talking about like tennis balls, we're talking about boulders, things you need two hands to throw. Okay, when you're throwing rocks at Israelis, then Israel has every right and obligation to intervene. So even if it's your holy site, if you're throwing how much respect do you have for your holy site if you're using it as like to throw Molotov cocktails at people? But overall, if you're using any institution as a base for terror, then Israel has the responsibility to respond. And there were the pictures from the Temple Mount. Mind you guys, I live in Israel, so like we see what's going on. It's like a tree caught on fire on the Temple Mount. How did it catch on fire? Who's throwing Molotov cocktails? Like, under what circumstances are you throwing Molotov cocktails? Like, why is that? And they'll say like, oh, the Jews are blaming, right? They blame everything on us. Go figure. But like realistically, we're not like we're an official army. We have a full police force. We don't fight with Molotov cocktails. That's like ridiculous. So every notion, like, you just need to look like, what is the cause and effect? Sheikh Jarrah, right? You guys saw Sheikh Jarrah in the news, and we'll start wrapping up because I realize we've been doing this for a little while. But Sheikh Jarrah, if you like, what's the headline that everyone around the world went with? That Israel is evicting Palestinians from their homes. Wow, what a terrible people. Really, what happened was Jews bought the land in the 1800s. The Jews got kicked out of the land because it swapped so many times that you had the Ottoman Empire, and you had the British, and then you had the Jordanians, and they didn't allow Jews to live there. After we had our state, after after the British left, after the Jordanians ended their occupation of Jerusalem, Jews went back, and lo and behold, Arabs are living there. Jews haven't been there in a couple of decades. That you had these Palestinian families living there. And they said, this is where my father was living. Right, okay, fine. We can all agree that Jews owned this land previously, but we're living here now. So the Jews said, fine, you want to continue living here? We don't want to live here right now. Just pay us rent, like any landowner in the world. We own the land, you're living here, you're gonna pay us rent. They weren't paying rent. So a couple of families were getting evicted. The way the news made it out, you would think thousands of people were being dragged out of their homes by Israeli military officials. A couple of families were not paying rent. Just like anywhere else in the world, if you don't pay rent, you get evicted. That is the story, right? But the way the news latches on, because it feeds into this propaganda machine against Israel. So anytime, and obviously we can continue going for hours, but anytime someone says anything negative about Israel, say, let's look into this. Don't always trust the headlines. Typically the headlines are wrong in anything, because news agencies just want to get news out, because like clickbait, like, oh wow, that's a really enticing title. Let me read more about that. But like typically, if you pay attention, there's always more to the story. There's always more to the story. That goes without saying. But saying like, why don't we discover together what's going on? Because I know Israel to be a moral country. I know Israel will do everything it can to do what's right by everyone. So it's shocking to me that they would take on this policy. With that, we really can, and I'm happy to stay on, but I don't want to keep anyone. I don't know, was it 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock by you guys? I don't know what time it is, but I'm happy. I'll stay on answering questions, but you guys like shouldn't feel, Nicole, if you want to wrap up, and then I'll continue answering questions.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if we could give it 5 more minutes and then wrap up, or do you want to like take ownership on your own?
Whatever you want.
We'll give it 5 more minutes and then we'll wrap up, and you can share your email and people can reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys can I'll put that right now. People love messaging on Instagram, so you can do that also. Okay, so absolutely, you guys can feel free anytime. Joey asked, what would you say about the Nakba? Okay, Nakba is the okay, so Nakba is the term that Palestinians have for what our Yom HaAtzmaut is, what our Israeli Independence Day is. So what Israeli Independence Day is to us is catastrophe to Palestinians. What you're celebrating is actually our greatest sorrow. The day you became a state is the day we lost ours. So there are Palestinians who walk around and they say, this is the key to my house that you took from us. So for them, like it's it is unfortunate because anytime anyone gets kicked out of their home, mind you, a lot of them left of their own free will. In 1967, the Arab state said, we're going to come in and we're going to destroy, we're going to get rid of all the Jews, we're going to kill all the Jews. So you guys should leave and not get caught in the crossfire. And then we'll come back. And once all the Jews are dead, then we'll rebuild and you can have your state. Not everybody left of their own free will. Even we are motive that we had to kick some of them out for the purposes of going to war. But in the end of the day, we ended up winning that war. And then you have these 700,000 refugees. So those are these 700,000 people, and their descendants say like, oh, we're still living this catastrophe. We've never gotten over leaving our homeland. There is a notion in the world that at some point you need to move on with your life. Like, are we going to be saying 300 years from now that are we still going to be having this conversation? At what point do you say like, all right, time to move on? The Jews are clearly not going anywhere. Bye, Ashley. So good to see you. So at what point do you say that? There is a statute of limitations on this. When the Jews got when the survivors left the camps in Poland, they didn't go back to their hometowns. Or if they did, they found Poles living there in their houses. And they didn't say, wow, this is my house. Or if they did, they said, it's our house now. Like, you left. Like, we didn't leave. We were dragged by Nazis to death camps. Like, let's not pretend like, oh, we gave up ownership. But in the end of the day, the world moved on. So we created our own state. We came to Israel, we built kibbutzim, we started and we built a nation. So that's what we tell the Palestinian people. We've given you land. We gave you Area A. We gave you Gaza. We gave you the opportunity. We continue to offer peace deals, giving you more land, giving you more opportunities, giving you more money. The United States offered $50 billion to the Palestinians to stimulate their economy, and they said no. Who turns down $50 billion? Okay, that notwithstanding, so like it gets to the point, like they're gonna say like this is our catastrophe, but we all just need to come to terms. The Jews aren't going anywhere. Like, this is our ancestral homeland. This is where we belong. So with that, I'll wrap up. You guys can reach out any questions you have. I'm more than happy to help any step of the way. It's not an easy conversation, but and everyone likes being nuanced and, oh, we need to see both sides, but we also need to see basic truths. And that's something, if nothing else, to the conversations you should have on social media. Rule number one, never talk with anyone who wants you dead, and understand where people are coming from. But if they're really prepared to have the conversation, establish those basic truths, establish for each other and say, can we at least agree that we want a better future together and that we're prepared to coexist? And God willing, we should experience peace, hopefully within our time.
Amen.
Amen. So look, you guys should come visit Israel also. Come visit. It's not a war zone. Everything's amazing. I went to the Shuk today. I was in the old city. You guys come, please. If you need a tour guide, I'm happy to take you around. Really, it's an amazing place, and cannot wait to see you all here. Wow.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel, for speaking with us for so long at such a late hour for you. And it's really been so informative, insightful. I don't even know what adjectives to put on it, but we really appreciate your time. And I know, as Daniel said, he's very approachable, very easy to reach out to. So please feel free to message him or to email him. And we hope to continue to do more events like this, in person, on Zoom, all of the things. If you want to know more about what's going on with NCSY, even after you graduate high school, you can always reach out to us. Alumni@ncsy.org, or Judah Fellowship is our campus initiative. As Matt and Rebecca know very well, they are a part of it. And yeah, that's it for now. You can always reach out with any questions, and we will say goodnight.
Thank you guys. Have a great Shabbos.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.